Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Scoliosis Dialogues. I'm your host, Jason Brooks, and I am very excited to be joined by a guest co-host, Dr. Khoi D. Dr. D, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks.
Perfect. And we have Dr. Than here because we have a even more special guest that we're interviewing today, Dr. Reg Hade. Welcome, sir.
Morning, guys. Great to be here.
Awesome. So glad to have all of you all. As we know, IMAST is fast approaching, and there is some significant history with IMAST and Reg, as well as just the neurosurgeons in general. But before we get into that, Reg, if you could tell us a little bit more about where you were born and how you got into deciding to be a doctor.
Oh gosh, I wasn't expecting that. Well, I'm a hick from Appalachia. Grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. My dad's boss had a son who was at Columbia Med School, and I was a kid in junior high school, and he'd come back and tell me about med school. I always had a societal interest to give back. I like science, and so medicine just seemed like the perfect place to go.
Perfect. And so from there, you went to medical school and then decided to choose orthopedics. Who were your mentors? Sorry, of course, my bias to ortho was there. So you decided to go into neurosurgery. Who were your mentors in neurosurgery in medical school that kind of showed you that this is the field that you wanted to pursue?
Oh gosh, well, I went to med school to be a pediatrician, ended up becoming a neurosurgeon because it's hard, right? I wanted to. I like the brain. I was a philosophy theology major, and I wanted something that's technically challenging and physically challenging, emotionally, intellectually. And the guy there was a guy named Bob Nugent, who's now passed. And the residents were just cool dudes, and it seemed like a fun thing to do. I thought about orthopedic surgery. I later, after I completed neurosurgery, did an orthopedic spine fellowship for a year. So because at the time I was going to be a brain surgeon, and I found out that neurosurgeons didn't know a lot about spine at that point. They had a very limited knowledge. And so I had a person named Eric Jones, a pediatric orthopedist. Abbott Bird was another young spine orthopedist. And they kind of took me under their wing. So I was a senior resident. I would go scrub in the orthopedic spine cases while they were doing Luque pedicle screws and learn to harvest bone grafts and things like that.
That's really interesting. So, just from a relational standpoint, did you find that there was any opposition from any of the orthopedic surgeons to kind of you slowly coming onto their turf, or was it more collegial than you expected?
Oh, no, there was opposition from both sides. I was told by the chairman of neurosurgery I'm wasting my career to go do a spine fellowship. Ron DeWalt, we're going to talk about in a few minutes. The first time I met him, he goes, "Son, neurosurgeons have no business in the spine."
Wow.
So there was a mixed bag from both groups. And at that point, to be a young neurosurgeon doing spine, we were sort of the bastard stepchilds, right? We were not really accepted by either the old guard neurosurgical community nor the old guard orthopedic spine community.
That's interesting. How times have changed. So, of course, we had initially talked about IMAST, and there is a history with you and the formation of the IMAST group. And I'm going to just transition over to Khoi so he can kind of start asking you some of those questions.
Yeah, absolutely, Reg. So, our understanding is that you're the first neurosurgeon who was ever involved with the IMAST meeting. And can you tell us more about the history of IMAST as well as, your involvement?
Sure. Well, it all goes back to pedicle screws, okay? Because in 1988, the SRS and NAS decided to give a hands-on pedicle screw course. Ron DeWald was the president of NAS. Tom Whitecloud, God rest his soul, a good friend of mine, was the chair of instrumentation. And Randy Betts, my friend, was in charge of education. So they did a pedicle screw course. So the first IMAST course, the first course was not IMAST. It just was a SRS, NAS pedicle screw course. So what was happening is NAS and SS with Ron DeWald and Randy Betts and Tom were doing pedicle screw courses. I, in conjunction with the AANS, the Neurosurgical Association, and industry, were also doing pedicle screw courses. So Danik, which became Sophomore Danik, which became Medtronic, taught pedicle screw courses. I would co-direct that as a neurosurgeon with Steve Heim, orthopedist out of Chicago. So we were both on our merry ways teaching neurosurgeons how to do pedicle screws. Well, you guys may not realize this, but in 1993, pedicle screw litigation hit. And the FDA came out with a letter to industry saying pedicle screws were off-label. We could not teach them. And that changed the industry completely. What then happened is NAS and SRS said, we'll go out of country. So the 93 letter from the FDA came out. Pedicle screw course was going to be moved out of country because the FDA doesn't regulate OUS. Well, NAS pulled out. They got scared. And so the SRS said, okay, fine. We will do a pedicle screw course in 1994. So the origin of the first SRS only course was in Munich in 1994. And that was underwritten by the SRS and the German Spine Society with Jürgen Harms helping out. But at that point, the brochure came out. So, okay, FDA, 93, 94, we go to Munich. And I've got a couple notes here. The course was called American European Meeting on Pedicle Fixation of the Spine and Other Advanced Techniques. That was the first one, truly. Well, after that, Carolyn said that name is too long. And after the brochure was out, she changed it to IMAST, International Meeting of Advanced Spine Techniques. And we have the acronym IMAST. And that's what changed that.
That is so interesting. Just more so, I never thought that government regulation would have been the nidus for the IMAST meeting. That's not usually kind of like a founding story that you normally hear. Just really interesting.
Well, that's another lecture of a whole different time. But so there were Steffi. So I went to orthopedics spine to learn the Clottrell Dubusse and pedicle screws. At that time, there was a Luque pedicle screws. There was a Wiltsey. There was the Steffi. There wasn't, and then the Roy Kimmy and things like Edwards. So Acromed settled for $100,000. Ron Picker, the CEO, sophomore Danik, actually fought it. And without him fighting it, we probably would not have won that battle. So I was actually deposed for 2 days, 7 hours a day by the FDA. And we subsequently won and were able to do pedicle fixation and teach pedicle fixation. We could still do it at the time, but it was, quote, off-label. So thus began our understanding of on-label uses, off-label uses, things like that. The same event occurred to a minor degree with posterior cervical lateral mass screws.
That is
so. Also in 1994, Lutz Biederman of Motec Biederman that worked with Harms gave a grant. So we were kind of flying by the seat of our pants. Well, what happened is Randy Betts and I were also teaching courses in Cancun and the South Americans and things like that about spine that we couldn't teach techniques in the United States. So Randy and I became friends. So Randy asked me about 99 or 2000 as a neurosurgeon and an orthopedist to come on and be a course director. So it was about that time I've got a couple notes, in 1999, 2000, Barcelona, Montreux, that Randy was a chairman, Larry Linke was a director, I was director, Dave Pauly was a director, and then Marco Brida Bruno was a director. And then it just kind of took off from there. So it's really interesting. I've got the notes here, and Randy and I've talked about this. The first course was in Munich. The second pedicle screw course was in Bermuda. They had in Bermuda in 97, there were 10 SRS members, 43 non-members. That was it for surgeons. If you counted the personnel, the companies, everybody, there were 196.
Wow.
Right now, pre-pandemic, we're 1,000 to 1,200, right? And so by the time that I started helping in Barcelona in 2000, Bahamas, Montreux. By Montreux in 2002, we had about 500 people there. So the thing and it was mainly a way to get surgeons and companies together, OUS, so we could teach things outside of the purview of the FDA. And then after that, by 2002, we actually had, out of 60 faculty, we had 5 neurosurgeons. So about that time, the SRS was trying, they were trying to understand that the neurosurgeons were here. So I was, as we talked about, I was one of the young Turks, and there was a thing called a senior think tank, and I was the first neurosurgeon. I was the token neurosurgeon, Jaysson. So they had Rhonda Wald, Courtney Brown, Bradford. These people were Ed Dawson. They were all SRS presidents, and they invited me in. Rhonda Wald said, little boy, and I showed at that time, this was 30 years ago, titanium plates, lateral mass fixation, and screws into the occiput. Because I was a neurosurgeon, right? That's wanted me to talk on. I started talking about titanium and 6-4 vanadium alloys, commercially pure alloys, and stress shielding. And all of a sudden, Courtney Brown and Ed Dawson and Bradford and I, we became friends, played golf together. About that time in 91, I was offered a job at UCSF, and Bradford said, Reg, we really don't work with neurosurgeons here, but maybe we'll start. I hired this young person, Serena who? So the first time I heard Serena's name was in 91, interviewing at UCSF, because Bradford was bringing her on about this time. So as you mentioned earlier, the whole ortho neuro thing kind of started to gel, kind of started to coalesce. We weren't the ugly stepchildren anymore. And that relationship grew. That the SRS then said, maybe we'll have neurosurgeons become members. So there were a bunch of old guys like me they reached out to, and they said, if you apply, we will grandfather you in. So the spine section of the NSCNS started inviting neurosurgeons. SRS started inviting neurosurgeons. At the first spine cadaver courses in Bethesda, Maryland in the early 90s, we invited Andreas Weidner from Germany, Dieter Grove, people like this to come over and teach both ortho and neurosurgeons spine. So there was myself and Kevin Foley. We were in the neurosurgical military at that point. Dave Pauly was in the neurosurgical military, Steve Andra. So a bunch of us young guys were actually teaching each other spinal instrumentation in Bethesda at a cadaveric lab. We became friends, drinking buddies, and the whole SRS IMAST relationship continued to grow. Out of that, it was very organic. It was not this planned deal. It's just that we saw ourselves as spine surgeons, first and foremost. And we were committed to make spine surgery writ large a global phenomenon. And then IMAST just picked up momentum. The SRS picked up momentum. Industry picked up momentum. And it became, from less than 200 people, all total, to more than 1,200. So it's just I've been blessed. I caught the right wave. And it started off with friendships. Randy Betts and I were teaching, and Tom Whitecloud and I would teach, and he'd say, Red, show me how to do lateral mass fixation. And so it started off as ortho neuro friends teaching courses and teaching each other how to do this.
Reg, it's so interesting. Thanks for sharing that story. It's so interesting that what started off as a pedicle screw course in the early to mid 1990s has blossomed to what it is today. Can you talk a little bit about how you see IMAST today to encourage those who may not know to attend the meeting?
Yeah. Well, it's evolved. Again, it started off as a pedicle screw course in '88, so it's been a long time. So now it's ortho, neuro. We try to do it globally, like SRS. So we switch locations around the world, and it's really to share techniques and nuances. Pardon me. It's not just to escape the FDA anymore. So IMAST has always been a cutting edge place where a surgeon, right? Really technical surgeons can come and talk about who, how, why, how not to. When it messes up, how do you fix it? What's the cutting edge techniques? And it's just been a very intellectually interesting place because you have great thought leaders, great surgeons, and industry supports this because as we continue to develop new technologies, robotics, virtual reality, augmented reality, et cetera. So it's just a fun place to go. And a lot of us have become friends. You know, it's always it's the social gathering after the meeting in the evenings during lunch is an important part because we're a community. And if the pandemic showed us nothing than that, it's that how as human beings, the community is important and the community in person. So I would urge all of you that can't to log onto these podcasts and to come to Dublin in person. If you can't make Dublin, come the following years because the in-person meetings are so much better, so much better.
I totally agree. I have relished being able to shake hands with people and stop all these Zoom calls. And so that has certainly been pleasurable. I wanted to end with this final question. You know, I think IMAST as a whole started with innovation. And unfortunately, we had to leave the US in order to kind of work on that innovation. You know, you've kind of seen the whole gamut from start to what it is now. Do you believe that there is a location in the world where innovation is centered, or has innovation as a whole in spine surgery changed? You know, because I think that's the most interesting thing with all of the robotics at play now and technology, and there's so many new things coming on board. Is that how do you see innovation in spine deformity surgery evolving from here on out? And do we still have to kind of escape the US to really make those big jumps because the FDA still does exist?
Yep. Great question. It's spine writ large, not just spine deformity, right? Every spine surgeon is a deformity surgeon. You either make it or fix it. So it's really interesting. Okay. Back in 86, 88, when I was in my fellowship time, Roy Camille was in Paris, right? So that he was promoting lateral mass fixation pedicle screws. Magrel, Grobe, Andreas Weidner in Davos and Germany. Luque in Mexico City. Zilke. So if you go back, the AO physicians, a lot of the stuff came out of Europe. A lot of the first instrumentation techniques came out of Europe for a variety of reasons. Fast forward to endoscopy. Endoscopy in Asia is amazing, right? So I would think a lot of our endoscopic techniques come out of Asia. A lot of the endoscopes come out of Germany. If you look at robotics, it's coming out of the United States and Germany. So I think as we become a more global society, and as ortho-neuro works together and as technology picks up, depending upon the kind of technique, I think it's more global now. And I think the FDA, it's not such a big deal. And the companies are learning how to work around that. If you go, for instance, to a company, Discogenics, which is not fusing, it's actually regenerating the disc. They started off as a company in Europe, went to Dublin, with the United States. Now they're pivotal and their first level studies are in Japan and the United States. The FDA just gave a rapid clearance for this in our country. So I think the FDA has become more sophisticated. It's not quite as onerous. I think surgeons and industry partners have learned how to navigate this. There'll still be hot pockets throughout the world, but I think it's a much more global movement now.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. You know, I think the fact that you're the first neurosurgeon is amazing, but more importantly, it's amazing to see so many more neurosurgeons now involved with the SRS and IMAST. And I could only imagine that our patients will benefit from us coming together more as we treat patients with these challenging spine deformities. Thank you, Khoi, for being my guest host today. Thank you, Reg, for giving us that amazing history. So much to think about as we look to the future. To our listeners, thank you so much for tuning on to another episode of Scoliosis Dialogues. More importantly, we hope you all listen to this and decide to register and attend IMAST in Dublin, because it's going to be an amazing meeting. We look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you, Jaysson. Thank you, Reg.
Thank you, guys.
The Scoliosis Research Society is a nonprofit professional organization made up of physicians and allied health personnel. Their primary focus is on providing continuing medical education for healthcare professionals and on funding and supporting research in spinal deformities. Please visit srs.org for further information.